Other than those gestures, Uther hardly moved, except to stir himself when a slave brought him water, bread, or a medicine that Morgan had made from coltsfoot steeped in mead to calm his cough. He left the dais only once, to piss against the hall's rear wall, while Tudric, ever patient and ever careful, considered a border dispute between two chiefs of his own kingdom. Uther spat into his urine to avert its evil, then limped back to the dais as Tudric gave his judgment, which, like all the others, was recorded on parchment by 3 scribes sitting at a table behind the dais. Uther was saving his small energy for the most important business of the day, which came after dusk. It was a dark twilight, and Tudric's servants had fetched a dozen more blazing torches into the hall. It had also begun to rain hard, and the hall became chill as streams of water found holes in the roof and dripped onto the floor or ran in rivulets down the rough brick walls. It was suddenly so cold that a brazier, an iron basket full 4 feet across, was filled with logs and set ablaze close to the High King's feet. The royal shields were moved, and Tudric's throne shifted aside so that the brazier's warmth could reach Uther. The wood smoke drifted about the room, eddying in the high shadows as it searched for a way out to the beating rain. Uther at last stood to address the High Council. He was unsteady, and so leaned on a great boar spear as he spoke his mind about his kingdom. Dumnonia, he said, had a new Edling, and the gods must be thanked for that mercy. But the Edling was weak, a baby, and had a crippled foot. Murmurs greeted the confirmation of that rumoured ill omen, but subsided as Uther lifted a hand for silence. The smoke wreathed about him, giving him a spectral look, as though his soul was already clad in his other world's shadow body. Gold glinted at his neck and on his wrists, and a thin fillet of gold, the High King's crown, circled his straggling white hairs. "I am old," he said, "and I will not live long." He calmed the protests with another feeble wave of his hand. "I do not claim my kingdom to be above any other in this land, but I do say that if Dumnonia falls to the Saxons, then all Britain will fall. If Dumnonia falls, then we lose our links to Armorica and our brethren beyond the sea. If Dumnonia falls, then the Saxon will have divided the land of Britain, and a divided land cannot survive." He paused, and for a second I thought he was too tired to continue. But then that great bull's head reared up, and he spoke again. "The Saxons must not reach the Severn Sea!" He shouted that creed, which had been at the very heart of his ambitions all these years. So long as the Saxons were hemmed in by Britons, then there was a chance that they could one day be driven back into the German Sea. But if they once reached our western coast, then they would have divided Dumnonia from Gwent, and the Britons of the south from the Britons of the north. "The men of Gwent," Uther went on, "are our greatest warriors." And here he nodded in tribute to Agricola. "But it is no secret that Gwent lives on Dumnonian bread. Dumnonia must be held, or Britain will be lost. I have a grandson, and the kingdom is his. The kingdom is Mordred's to rule when I die. That is my law." And here he stamped his spear on the platform, and for a moment the old hard force of the Pendragon shone from his eyes. Whatever else would be decided here, the kingdom would not pass from Uther's line, for that was Uther's law, and everyone in the hall now knew it. All that remained was to decide how the crippled child should be protected until he was old enough to assume the kingship for himself. And so the talking began, although everyone knew what had already been decided. Why else was Gundlius slouching so cocksure in his throne? Yet some men still advanced other candidates for Norwenna's hand. Prince Geraint, the Lord of the Stones, who held Dumnonia's Saxon borderlands, proposed Murig ap Tudrig, Gwent's Edling. But everyone in the hall knew that the proposal was merely a way of flattering Tudrig, and would never be accepted because Murig was a mere nose-picking child who had no chance of holding Dumnonia against the Saxons. Geraint, his duty done, sat and listened as one of Tudric's councillors proposed Prince Kynaglas, Gorfithed's eldest son, and thus the Edling of Powys. A marriage to the enemy's crown prince, the councillor claimed, would forge a peace between Powys and Dumnonia, the two most powerful British kingdoms. But the suggestion was ruthlessly beaten down by Bishop Bedwin, who knew his master would never bequeath his kingdom to the care of a man who was the son of Tudric's bitterest enemy. Tristan, Prince of Kernau, was another candidate, but he demurred, knowing full well that no one in Dumnonia would trust his father, King Mark. Meriadoc, Prince of Strongor, was suggested, but Strongor, a kingdom east of Gwent, was already half lost to the Saxons, and if a man could not hold his own kingdom, how could he hold another? What of the royal houses in Armorica, someone asked, but no one knew whether the princes across the sea would abandon their new land of Brittany to defend Dumnonia. Gundlius. It all came back to Gundlius. But then Agricola spoke the name that almost every man in the hall both wanted to hear and feared to hear. The old soldier stood, his Roman armour bright and his shoulders braced, and he looked Uther the Pendragon straight in his rheumy eyes. "Arthur," Agricola said. "I propose Arthur." Arthur. The name resounded in the hall. Then the dying echo was drowned by the sudden clatter of staves thumping on the floor. The applauding spearmen were warriors of Dumnonia, men who had followed Arthur into battle and knew his worth. But their rebellion was brief. Uther the Pendragon, High King of Britain, raised his own spear and brought it down once. There was an immediate silence, in which only Agricola still dared to challenge the High King. "I propose that Arthur marries Norwenna," he said respectfully. And even I, young as I was, knew that Agricola must be speaking for his master, King Tudric. And that puzzled me, for I'd thought that Gundlius was Tudric's candidate. If Gundlius could be detached from his friendship with Powys, then the new alliance of Dumnonia, Gwent, and Siluria would hold all the land on either bank of the Severn Sea, and that triple alliance would be a bulwark against both Powys and the Saxons. I should have known, of course, that Tudric, in suggesting Arthur, was inviting a refusal that would have to be recompensed by a favour. "Arthur ap Neb," Uther said, and that last word was greeted with a gasp of horrified surprise, "is not of the blood." There could be no argument with such a decree, and Agricola, accepting his defeat, bowed and sat. Neb meant nobody, and Uther was denying that he was Arthur's father, thereby stating that Arthur had no royal blood, and could not therefore marry Norwenna. A Belgic bishop argued for Arthur by protesting that kings had ever been chosen from the nobility, and that customs which had served in the past should serve in the future. But his querulous objection was stilled by one fierce look from Uther. Rain whirled in through one of the high windows and hissed in the fire. Bishop Bedwin stood again. It might have seemed that until this moment all talk of Norwenna's future had been so much wasted breath. Yet at least the alternatives had been aired, and men of sense could thus understand the reasoning behind the announcement Bedwin now made. Gundlius of Siluria, Bedwin said mildly, was a man without a wife. There was a murmur in the hall, as men remembered the rumours of Gundlius's scandalous marriage to his low-born lover, Ladwis. But Bedwin blithely ignored the disturbance. Some weeks before, the bishop continued, Gundlius had visited Uther and made his peace with the High King, and it was now Uther's pleasure that Gundlius should marry Norwenna and be a protector. He repeated the word, a protector to Mordred's kingdom. As an earnest of his good intention, Gundlius had already paid a price in gold to King Uther, and that price had been accepted as fitting. There were those, Bishop Bedwin admitted airily, who might not trust a man who had until so recently been an enemy. But as a further earnest of his change of heart, Gundlius of Siluria had agreed to abandon Siluria's ancient claim to the kingdom of Gwent, and, further, he would become a Christian by being publicly baptized in the River Severn beneath Gleevam's walls the very next morning. The Christians who were present all called out, "Hallelujah!" But I was watching the druid Tanaburs, and wondered why the wicked old fool showed no sign of disapproval, as his master so publicly disavowed the old religion. I wondered, too, why these grown men were so quick to welcome a former enemy. But of course they were desperate. A kingdom was being passed to a crippled child, and Gundlius, for all his treacherous past, was a famous warrior. If he proved true, then the peace of Dumnonia and Gwent was assured. Yet Uther was no fool, and so he did his best to protect his grandson, should Gundlius prove false. Dumnonia, Uther decreed, would be ruled by a council until Mordred was of age to pick up the sword. Gundlius would preside over the council, and a half-dozen men, chief of them Bishop Bedwin, would serve as his councillors. Tudric of Gwent, Dumnonia's firm ally, was invited to send 2 men, and the council, so composed, would have the final governance of the land. Gundlius was not pleased at the decision. He had not paid 2 baskets of gold to sit in a council of old men, but he knew better than to protest. He held his peace as his new bride and his stepson's kingdom were bound about with rules. And still more rules were laid down. Mordred, Uther said, would have 3 sworn protectors, men bound by death oaths to defend the boy's life with their own. If any man harmed Mordred, then the oath-takers would revenge the harm or else sacrifice their own lives.